Welcome back, everyone, to The Deep Dive. We're tackling something, a question that a lot of people seem to be asking these days, which is, how can we boost well-being? And not just for ourselves, but for everyone. You guys have sent in some really interesting research and articles this week, and we're excited to share the key takeaways. What do you think?
Yeah, it's definitely a timely topic. I mean, the world is changing so fast, and it's impacting how we live, how we connect, and ultimately how we feel.
Right, yeah, and let's just start with what's happening right now in terms of mental health, especially for younger generations. I'm sure you've seen the data, but anxiety and depression seem to be on the rise, particularly among teens.
Yeah, that's right. Researchers are seeing a significant increase in what they call internalizing disorders, conditions like anxiety and depression, where the distress is primarily felt internally. This is in contrast to externalizing disorders, where the distress manifests in more outward behaviors. So like aggression or delinquency.
I see. Okay. Well, that's kind of a scary thought, though. What's even more alarming is that this isn't just an isolated trend. Studies show this, steep climb in teen depression rates globally, starting around 2012, across all demographics. And it makes you wonder, almost like something fundamentally shifted around that time, don't you think?
Yeah, it's fascinating. Researchers are trying to understand the why behind this shift. One leading theory is what some are calling the Great Rewiring. The idea that we've moved from a play-based childhood to a phone-based one. And this transition has profound implications for mental well-being.
Wow. The Great Rewiring. Kind of ominous when you think about it like that. I mean, could this be why Gen Z seems to be struggling more with mental health than millennials? Because they're the first generation to really grow up in a world completely saturated by digital technology. It's like they grew up on Mars.
It's a compelling theory, yeah. I mean, think about it this way. Real-world play is how young mammals learn. It's how they develop crucial social skills, emotional regulation, and risk assessment. It's hardwired into their development.
Yeah, it's true. And you think about it like those old playground spinners from the 70s. Kids would be whirling around on this metal disc at what felt like 1,000,000 miles an hour.
Yeah.
Looking back, it seems pretty dangerous, but it also taught them a lot about risk, self-regulation, and even cooperation.
Yeah. Exactly. Children were learning by interacting with their physical environment and with each other. This kind of active engagement allows their brains to develop in ways that simply aren't replicated by staring at a screen.
Yeah, so what happens when those real-world hands-on experiences are replaced by a phone or a tablet? Stands to reason that the type of learning and development is going to be drastically different. So could this shift be one of the factors driving the mental health challenges that we're seeing today?
It's certainly a plausible explanation, and there's a growing body of research that supports this connection. One area of particular concern is how social media impacts social learning, especially during the critical adolescent years.
Right, and that makes sense because humans are hardwired to learn socially, right?
Right.
We're constantly observing and imitating others, especially those that we perceive as successful or influential.
Right. We possess these two innate learning programs. One is conformist bias, where we copy the majority. And the other one is prestige bias, where we imitate those we admire. But what's concerning is how social media platforms exploit these very biases. They've managed to quantify prestige through likes and followers. It's created this feedback loop that can be incredibly potent, especially for, developing minds.
Wow. It's almost chilling when you think about it that way. Sean Parker, who is an early Facebook leader, he actually admitted that they intentionally created a system that exploits a vulnerability in human psychology.
Yeah.
They knew it was potentially harmful, but they do it anyway.
Crazy. It's a stark admission. And it really highlights this immense power these platforms wield, especially over adolescents who are still figuring out who they are and where they fit in. And this influence doesn't play out the same way for everyone either. Social media seems to affect boys and girls very differently.
Absolutely. I mean, for girls, social media often just exacerbates all of those concerns about body image and social comparison. It's like a breeding ground for insecurity and, all these negative emotions. Remember that internal Facebook study that found that Instagram makes body image issues worse for 1 in 3 teenage girls?
Right.
That's really disturbing.
It is. And because girls are often more attuned to their emotions and more influenced by their peers, these negative feelings can spread like wildfire. But boys face their own kind of unique challenges in the age of social media, too. We're seeing a decline in traditional male roles, a growing allure of video games, and also, the potential risks associated with excessive gaming and pornography.
Right. It's almost like we're in uncharted territory with all of this. It makes you wonder about trends like the hikikomori phenomenon in Japan, if you heard about this, where young men are withdrawing from society completely, often spending months or even years isolated in their rooms. Like, is this a glimpse into a potential future for male well-being?
It's a question worth pondering. You know, there are parallels between the challenges faced by the hikikomori and the struggles that many young men face in other cultures. Finding their place, navigating social expectations, coping with feelings of isolation. But even beyond gender, I often find myself feeling overwhelmed by the sheer volume of information and negativity online. It's exhausting.
I know exactly what you mean. You know, it reminds me of Thomas Jefferson's idea about actions that elevate versus degrade us.
Yeah.
And it feels like a lot of what we consume online is pulling us down, almost like a kind of spiritual degradation.
Yeah, that's a really insightful way to frame it. You know, in this phone-based life, we've kind of lost touch with those sacred spaces and rituals that connect us to something bigger than ourselves. Everything has become about, self-presentation and seeking validation from others. We're constantly plugged in, bombarded with information, and it's taking a toll.
So how do we combat this? I mean, if technology is so ingrained in our lives, how do we reclaim a sense of well-being? It seems like such a daunting task. Where do we even begin? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, it is a daunting task, but it's not insurmountable, I don't think. Reclaiming well-being in this digital age requires this kind of multifaceted approach. We need to think about what we can do individually, but also what needs to happen at a societal level.
Right. So it's not as simple as just telling everyone to put down your phone.
Uh,
I mean, that's not really a realistic solution these days when so much of our lives revolve around these devices.
Exactly. But we can start advocating for change in the way technology is designed and regulated, particularly when it comes to protecting young people.
Okay, so what would that look like? Are we talking about like government regulations or is this something different?
Well, both, actually. We need to hold tech companies accountable for the potential harms that their products can cause, especially to developing minds. One really promising approach is this concept of a duty of care, which essentially means acknowledging that these companies have a responsibility to protect users from harm, especially children.
Oh, interesting. So it's kind of like recognizing that these tech giants have a moral obligation to prioritize user well-being over profits.
Precisely. And there are practical ways to implement this. The UK, for example, has introduced something called the Age-Appropriate Design Code, which sets standards for tech companies to make their products safer for children.
Okay, so what kind of standards are we talking about here?
Well, things like limiting data collection, restricting targeted advertising, and even designing platforms in ways that minimize the potential for addiction. The goal is to promote healthier usage patterns and give parents more control over their children's online experiences.
It seems like a pretty reasonable approach. I mean, we have regulations for food safety, product labeling, all sorts of things. It makes sense that we would need some safeguards in the digital world as well, especially for kids.
Yeah, I agree. And another important area is age verification. Right now it's far too easy for children to lie about their age and access content they shouldn't be seeing.
That's a really good point. I mean, I've read about social media platforms where there's just rampant underage users, even though they technically have age limits. It's like a never-ending game of whack-a-mole.
Exactly. But there are solutions being explored, like device-based age verification, which would allow parents to designate their children's devices as belonging to a minor, blocking access to age-restricted content.
That sounds like a pretty good step in the right direction. Gives parents more control without infringing on the privacy of adults who are using the internet responsibly.
Right. But beyond the tech world, we also need to think about what we can do on a more local level in our schools and communities.
Okay, so what can schools do to promote well-being in this kind of digital age that we live in?
Well, one of the simplest but most effective things that schools can do is to go completely phone-free.
Okay, so we're talking about a complete ban on phones during school hours. Not just in the classroom, but like everywhere on school grounds.
Exactly. And there's growing evidence that phone-free schools see significant improvements in student focus, engagement, and even social interaction.
That makes a lot of sense. If you remove the constant distraction and temptation, kids are more likely to be present and engaged in the real world. And I imagine it would also help reduce things like cyberbullying and social comparison, right?
Absolutely. And beyond going phone-free, schools can also incorporate more unstructured free play into their schedules.
So not just recess, but like actual time dedicated to letting kids just be kids, running around, exploring, using their imaginations.
Precisely. Free play is so crucial for developing social skills, emotional regulation, and even cognitive abilities. It's how children learn to navigate the complexities of the world, to problem solve, to cooperate and compete in healthy ways.
It's kind of amazing when you think about it, how we've somehow lost sight of the importance of play. We're so obsessed with structured activities, academics, and achievement that we've squeezed out one of the most fundamental and essential aspects of childhood.
It's a real loss. But thankfully, there's a growing awareness of this. Some schools are even experimenting with programs like the Let Grow Project, which encourages assigning homework that involves kids doing things independently without adult supervision.
Like what kind of things?
Oh, things like walking the dog, running an errand, even preparing a simple meal. The goal is to foster independence, responsibility, and a sense of agency, qualities that are critical for well-being.
So it's about shifting from overprotecting our kids to empowering them
Right.
to take on age-appropriate challenges and risks.
It is. It's about recognizing that they are capable and resilient individuals. We need to trust them to explore, to experiment, and to learn from their experiences, both the good and the bad. And this shift in mindset isn't just for schools. Parents and communities play a vital role as well.
Okay, so let's talk about parents then. What are some practical things that they can do to navigate the challenges of raising kids in this digital age? What's the parent playbook look like?
Well, first and foremost, it's about modeling healthy tech habits ourselves. Our kids are always watching us, and they learn from our behavior more than our words. If we're constantly glued to our phones, checking social media every 5 minutes, they're going to pick up on that.
Actions speak louder than words.
Exactly. So we need to be mindful of our own technology use and make a conscious effort to set a good example. But beyond that, there are specific strategies for managing screen time, setting boundaries, and promoting healthier tech habits within the family.
Okay, so give us some of those strategies. Let's get specific here. Give us the lowdown for parents who are trying to create a healthier digital environment for their kids.
Well, one of the most impactful things you can do is delay giving your child a smartphone for as long as possible, ideally until high school.
Okay, so we're really pushing back that first phone as long as we can. But what about all the other screens, though? Like the TVs, tablets, computers. I mean, they're everywhere.
Right. It's not about eliminating screens entirely, but it's about being mindful of how and when they're used. The key is to maximize those real-world experiences that are so essential for development. So things like free play, social interaction, spending time outdoors, and yes, even allowing for boredom.
Boredom. Really?
Yeah.
I mean, isn't that something most parents try to avoid at all costs?
It might seem kind of counterintuitive, but boredom is actually incredibly valuable. It forces kids to be creative, to use their imaginations, to find ways to entertain themselves without relying on, external stimulation.
Yeah. I guess it's like that old saying, necessity is the mother of invention. If kids are never bored, they never have to invent their own fun.
Exactly. And besides all that, structured activity and constant stimulation can be overwhelming. Children need downtime, unstructured time to just be. It's in those quiet moments that their minds can wander, their creativity can flourish, and they can connect with their inner world.
So we're reclaiming boredom. I like it. It feels almost like a mini revolution in parenting.
Yeah, think of it as a recalibration. We're shifting the balance back toward those real-world experiences that foster well-being. And part of that recalibration involves setting clear boundaries around screen time.
Ah, yes. Boundaries. That's music to a parent's ears. But how do we actually enforce them, though? I mean, kids are pretty tech-savvy these days. It feels like a constant battle.
I think consistency is key. Establish clear rules about when and where screens are allowed and stick to them as much as possible.
So like no phones at the dinner table, no screens in bedrooms, that kind of thing.
Exactly. Create those screen-free zones and family rituals that prioritize connection and face-to-face interaction. Meal times, for example, can be a wonderful opportunity to connect, share stories, and engage in meaningful conversations without the distraction of devices.
Right. Yeah, those are good examples. But what about those times when screens are allowed? Any tips for kind of making those experiences healthier?
Absolutely. Be mindful of the content they're consuming. Encourage them to engage with educational or creative apps rather than passively scrolling through social media or watching endless videos.
So it's kind of like quality over quantity when it comes to screen time.
Exactly. And just as important, make sure they're getting enough sleep. Sleep is crucial for mental and physical health, especially during the teenage years when their brains are still developing.
Yeah, sleep, the eternal struggle. It's particularly challenging with teenagers. Their sleep cycles seem to be completely out of sync with the rest of the world.
It's true. But you can encourage healthy sleep habits by establishing a consistent bedtime routine, ensuring their bedroom is dark and quiet, and most importantly, keeping all screens out of the bedroom.
So no late night scrolling or texting under the covers?
Right. And don't be afraid to enforce those boundaries, even if it leads to some pushback. Remember, you're the parent, and you have their best interests at heart.
It's not always easy, but it's definitely worth it in the long run.
Now, what about social media, though? I mean, it's such a huge part of teenage culture these days. How do we navigate that as parents?
The ideal scenario would be to delay social media accounts for as long as possible, at least until age 16. Let those young minds develop a bit more before exposing them to the pressures and potential pitfalls of the social media world.
Okay, that makes sense. But how do you deal with the inevitable peer pressure, though? The everyone else has it argument. It's a valid concern, but this is where community-level solutions can be really effective. If enough families in a school or community decide to delay social media, it creates a new norm, and the pressure lessens.
Right. It goes back to that idea of collective action, right? We can create a healthier environment for our kids if we kind of work together and support each other.
Absolutely. And beyond those kind of foundational strategies of delaying smartphones, limiting social media, and prioritizing real-world experiences, we can also actively foster well-being in our children by creating an environment where they feel loved, supported, and empowered.
So we're talking about like lots of hugs, family dinners, heart-to-heart conversations, that sort of thing.
All of that is incredibly important. But it's also about encouraging their interests, supporting their passions, and giving them opportunities to contribute to the family and the community. It's about helping them develop a sense of purpose, a sense of belonging, and a belief in their own abilities.
Yeah, and sometimes the simplest things can be the most powerful. Just spending quality time together, unplugged and fully present, can make all the difference.
I completely agree. Reading together, going for walks, playing games, just being together without distractions. These are the moments that create lasting memories and strengthen those precious bonds.
It's been a fascinating deep dive into the world of well-being in this digital age. As we wrap up, what's like the one key takeaway you hope our listeners will remember?
I would say this. Well-being is within our reach. It's not some elusive, unattainable ideal. It's about making small, intentional choices each day that nurture our own well-being and that of those around us. It's about being mindful of how we use technology, prioritizing real-world connections, and fostering a sense of meaning and purpose in our lives.
Very well said. And I would just add that we're not alone in this journey. There's this growing movement of people who are recognizing the importance of well-being and who are working to create a healthier, more fulfilling world for everyone.
That's so true. And as we've discussed, collective action is key. We can make a real difference, but we have to do it together.
That's a wrap on our deep dive into well-being in the age of experience blockers. We hope you found it informative and thought-provoking, and maybe even a little inspiring.
And remember, even small changes can have a ripple effect. What action will you take today to boost your own well-being or to help someone else thrive?
Until next time, keep diving deep.